The morning was like any other in New York City. The sun slanted through the dirty windows of the coffee shop, casting streaks of amber light across the well-worn countertops. People bustled in and out, tapping their smartphones, cradling their steaming cups, oblivious to the world outside. But Zane Liu, sitting alone at a corner table, was not so oblivious. He had never been a part of the world in that way, part of the crowd, part of the noise. Zane was a man obsessed. At 26, he had already earned a reputation in the field of mathematics, solving problems that stumped even the most seasoned experts. But in the past few months, Zane had become fixated on something far beyond numbers or equations. The quantum virus. This virus, so strange and so insidious, was unlike anything the world had seen. It had begun to spread in isolated pockets of the world's small towns, remote cities, and it hadn't taken long for people to realize that it wasn't a traditional disease. The virus didn't just attack the body. It infected time itself. Zane wasn't sure how to explain it. Even in the field of theoretical mathematics, where abstract concepts often came to life in equations, this was something new. The virus worked by causing time overlaps, reflections, as they had been called in the media. People who were infected began to see themselves or something like themselves emerging from the future. The future selves were real, tangible, walking through walls, appearing in mirrors, popping up in photos, sometimes even speaking to the present version of the infected. These glimpses weren't visions, they were events that were happening in real time. The past, present, and future started to bleed together. And with each new reflection, reality itself began to bend. Zane's fingers danced over his laptop keyboard as he stared at the screen. His mind was racing, running calculations faster than the machine could process. If he could just figure out the equation for the overlap, if he could understand the quantum mechanics behind it, then maybe he could solve the riddle of the virus. Or at least stop it. But as he typed, his concentration was broken by the sound of the door chimes jingling. He glanced up and saw a man walk in. At first, Zane barely registered the newcomer, an older man, dressed in a slightly too expensive suit for this humble coffee shop. He looked out of place, like a piece of debris caught in a whirlwind. The man's face was familiar, though Zane couldn't immediately place him. The man's eyes met Zane's for an instant, and a strange shiver ran down Zane's spine. The man smiled, a kind of half-smirk, and approached Zane's table, uninvited. There was something unnerving about the way he moved, the casualness of his presence. "Mind if I sit?" the man asked, his voice deep, rich with experience. Zane hesitated. He didn't really want to engage with anyone right now. But before he could respond, the man was already pulling out the chair across from him, sitting down without waiting for permission. Zane blinked, not sure what to say. "I'm sure you're wondering how I know who you are," the man continued, leaning forward with a strange intensity. His eyes seemed to glint in a way that was almost knowing. Zane frowned, closing his laptop. "Sorry, do I know you?" The man smiled again, but this time it wasn't a friendly smile. It was a smile that suggested he had something to say that Zane wouldn't like. "Oh, I think you know me, Zane," he said, using Zane's name without hesitation. "The question is, do you know yourself?" Zane felt a prickling sensation on the back of his neck. There was something deeply wrong with this man, like he didn't belong in this time, this space. And yet, Zane couldn't quite explain why he felt that way. "Who are you?" Zane asked, his voice coming out a little sharper than he intended. The man leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning Zane's face, as though he were reading an open book. He seemed almost pleased by Zane's discomfort. "I suppose I could give you a name, but I don't think it would mean anything to you. It's not important." He glanced around the coffee shop, as if checking for eavesdroppers. Then, lowering his voice, he added, "But I suppose you're trying to figure out the virus, aren't you? The quantum one? The one that's turning time into a mess?" Zane's heart skipped a beat. "How do you?" The man held up a hand, interrupting him. "No need to ask. I know everything you're thinking right now. I know exactly what you're working on. The equations, the calculations. The virus. The way the reflections are interfering with reality. I know because I've been there. He paused, letting the words sink in. Or should I say, I will be there. Zane stared at the man, confusion and disbelief swirling in his mind. The man continued, oblivious to Zane's growing unease. The future's already begun to collapse, you see, the man said, his voice almost a whisper now. Time's already tearing itself apart, one reflection at a time. And you're the one who will solve it. You'll need to. The world, it won't survive without you. Zane swallowed, his mind struggling to process what the man was saying. Time was collapsing. He had read about the quantum virus, yes, but it sounded like something out of a science fiction novel. Reflections? People from the future walking into the present? It didn't make any sense. The man's lips curled into a smile that sent another wave of unease through Zane. You're good with numbers. But can you solve this? Can you stop the virus before it's too late? Before Zane could respond, the air in the coffee shop seemed to flicker. For a brief, impossible moment, the world around him shifted like a lens going out of focus. The table, the chairs, the people in the background, they all seemed to bend, as if caught in the grip of something intangible. The man across from him blurred, his features shifting as though he were both there and not there at the same time. Zane blinked, trying to clear his vision, but when he opened his eyes, the man was gone. The coffee shop was back to normal. People were chatting. The barista was steaming milk. The air smelled faintly of espresso. But Zane couldn't shake the feeling that something had just changed. His fingers trembled as he opened his laptop again. He tried to focus on the equations in front of him, but his mind kept drifting back to the man's words, the virus. The future. Reflections, something was wrong with the world. Zane knew that now. Something much bigger than he had ever imagined was happening, and the answer might lie in the very equations he was trying to solve. But how could he solve it when time itself was falling apart? The strange encounter in the coffee shop lingered in Zane's mind like a distant echo, something too surreal to process in the moment but too haunting to ignore. The man's cryptic words reverberated in his thoughts, growing louder the more he tried to push them away. The future's already begun to collapse, you see. Zane couldn't escape that sentence. It had been said with such absolute certainty. The idea that the very fabric of time was at risk felt absurd and terrifying, but it also made sense in ways that Zane couldn't quite articulate. That he closed the laptop and stood up abruptly, the motion jolting him out of his seat. The air felt thicker now, charged with an odd energy, as if the world around him was holding its breath. Maybe it was just his mind playing tricks on him, but Zane couldn't shake the feeling that everything was connected: the virus, the reflections, and the disruptions in time. It was all starting to feel like a puzzle that was already half assembled, waiting for him to find the missing piece. He grabbed his coat and left the coffee shop, stepping out onto the bustling street. The city, as always, was alive with noise: the honking cars, the shuffling crowds, the hum of 1,000 conversations happening in parallel. But today, it felt different. It felt like there was something hidden beneath the surface, something he could almost sense but couldn't yet see. That he needed answers. Zane didn't want to admit it, but he knew that the man in the coffee shop had been right. The quantum virus was not some isolated anomaly. It was connected to something much larger, something beyond the comprehension of ordinary science. The phenomenon had been spreading globally, showing up in news reports as random, unexplainable events: people meeting their future selves, glimpses of the future appearing in dreams or in broken images on TVs. At first, scientists had dismissed it as a psychological byproduct of modern stress, a collective delusion brought on by a world teetering on the edge of collapse. But the more Zane studied it, the more the equations began to make sense. That it wasn't a delusion. It was real. The reflections weren't mere hallucinations. They were fractures in time. Zane had started to think of them as glitches that bent the flow of time and created small, uncontrollable intersections between the present and the future. The more Zane dug into the data, the more the patterns began to reveal themselves. People who had contracted the virus experienced the overlap more intensely. Some saw glimpses of their future lives, others, the death of loved ones, or the end of the world itself. Zane made his way to the lab, his steps quick and deliberate. His team was already there, scattered across the room, working through endless simulations and theories. But none of them were getting closer to understanding the true nature of the virus. They were trapped in a maze of numbers, unable to find a way out. "Zane," said Sophie, one of his closest colleagues, looking up from a whiteboard covered in indecipherable calculations. "We've got more data on the virus. It's spreading faster than we thought. And now we're seeing reports of people disappearing." Zane raised an eyebrow. Disappearing? Not disappearing as in vanishing. Disappearing as in leaving the present and appearing in the future. Or sometimes the past. People are flickering, like shadows moving between time periods. It's like the virus is erasing them from this moment and projecting them somewhere else. Sophie's words sent a chill down Zane's spine. He moved closer to the board, his eyes scanning the numbers, trying to make sense of them. But it was as if they were mocking him, each equation pushing him further into confusion. "What about the cause?" he asked, his voice tight. "Have we isolated the source?" Sophie shook her head. "Not yet. It's impossible. Every time we think we've found the origin, the data shifts. The timeline keeps shifting. Whatever this virus is, it's like trying to catch smoke in your hands. Nothing stays still long enough to study it." Zane stared at the board for a long time, his mind spinning. The more he looked at the numbers, the more it all seemed to blur together. He had been chasing the virus for months, trying to find its point of origin. But now, something in his gut told him that finding the source wasn't going to be enough. The virus wasn't just a contagion. It was a tool, a weapon, perhaps created by a future humanity trying to manipulate the past. Zane ran his hand through his hair, a thought beginning to take root in his mind. A weapon. A virus capable of distorting the flow of time. A weapon that could change history. And if the future had created such a weapon, what was the future trying to change? "We're not just looking at a virus," Zane said, his voice quieter now, but filled with a new urgency. "This is something else. This is a weapon." "Weapon?" Sophie repeated, her voice tinged with disbelief. "What do you mean?" Zane's eyes darkened. "The virus is trying to rewrite history. Not just for survival but for control. The future is trying to change the past." Sophie blinked, trying to process the magnitude of his words. But why? What could be so important that they would risk the collapse of time itself to change it? Zane swallowed hard. He wasn't sure yet, but he had a sinking feeling that whatever it was a disaster waiting to happen. Over the next few days, Zane became obsessed. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't eat. His mind was consumed by the idea that time itself was being weaponized. The more he worked, the more he started to see connections between the virus and the odd reflections that people were experiencing. The infected weren't just seeing flashes of their futures. They were living in them and in their present, simultaneously. Zane's own reflections had started appearing more frequently, visions of himself from different times, different versions of his life that he couldn't explain. But the more he thought about it, the clearer the puzzle became. These reflections weren't just random images. They were consequences of changes that hadn't happened yet. The virus was making people live out their futures before they had a chance to get there. But it was more than just a disruption. It was a distortion of time itself, a collapse. Every infected person created a new timeline, an alternative version of the future. Every change, every reflection, created a paradox, and the paradoxes were multiplying. Zane wasn't just solving an equation anymore. He was trying to stop the universe from tearing itself apart. He spent hours alone in the lab, his mind unraveling the complexities of the virus. He tried to map out the timeline of its spread, to understand the patterns of infection. But every time he thought he was getting closer to a breakthrough, the data shifted. People were seeing their futures, sure, but they were also seeing futures that didn't make sense, where they were dead, where cities had fallen, where the world had ended. At some point, Zane realized that the future he was trying to prevent was already happening now. One evening, as he worked late into the night, Zane's reflection appeared again. But this time, it wasn't just a vision of himself standing behind him in the glass. This time, his reflection stepped forward out of the mirror and into the present. Zane froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The man standing before him wasn't a stranger. It was him, but older. Much older. His face was lined with wrinkles, his hair touched with gray. His eyes, though his eyes were filled with a kind of quiet certainty that Zane hadn't seen before. "You've been looking for the solution, haven't you?" his reflection asked, his voice low and gravely. Zane couldn't speak. His throat felt tight, the weight of the moment pressing in on him. The older version of himself smiled, though it wasn't a reassuring smile. It was the smile of someone who had seen things he couldn't unsee. "You figured it out," the reflection said softly. "You've realized that it's not just a virus. It's a choice. And you're the one who has to make it." Zane's mind raced. What was he talking about? "A choice? You can stop the virus," the older Zane said, his voice growing sharper now. "You can sever the connection between the past and the future. But doing so will tear the timeline apart. Everything will collapse. Or you can let it continue, and the world as you know it will die." Zane's heart pounded in his chest. He had a choice. A choice that could mean the end of everything. The older version of himself reached out, placing a hand on Zane's shoulder. "You know what you have to do. Time is already changing. The future is already here. You're the one who has to decide." Zane took a step back, his mind racing with 1,000 possibilities. Could he stop the virus? Could he really sever the timelines? Or would the cost be too great? His reflection nodded, as though it could read his thoughts. The future is already rewriting itself. The only thing left to decide is whether you'll let it happen. Zane closed his eyes, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He knew what he had to do. But it felt like stepping off a cliff. The world around him was unraveling. Time was breaking, and now, he was the one who had to choose whether to fix it or let it fall apart forever. Zane stood frozen in the lab, his reflection still staring back at him with a kind of quiet insistence that rattled him to his core. The older version of himself seemed so real, so tangible, like he could reach out and shake Zane awake from whatever fever dream this had become. The words hung heavy in the air between them, and Zane could feel the weight of the choice pressing down on him with a crushing inevitability. "Time is already changing," the reflection repeated, almost as if it were a mantra. "The future is already here. The only thing left to decide is whether you'll let it happen." Zane's pulse thudded in his ears, a pounding rhythm that drowned out everything else. He turned his gaze from the reflection back to the lab, back to the equations and the swirling data, as though somehow the answers were hidden there. But the truth was, nothing made sense anymore. There was no equation for this. No neat little solution wrapped up in a formula he could punch into a computer. There was only chaos. And choice. Zane swallowed hard. He had seen the future, or at least parts of it, futures where the world had crumbled, futures where he had died, futures where nothing remained. But he had also seen the possibility of fixing it. He'd worked so hard to isolate the virus, to trace its source, to understand how it warped the very fabric of time. He had thought that understanding it would give him control. But now he saw that knowledge alone wasn't enough. The virus wasn't just a disease. It wasn't something you could contain or cure. It was a weapon created by the future, using the mechanics of time itself to rewrite history. And Zane had become the fulcrum, the point of leverage where everything would tip one way or the other. "You're not just a mathematician," his reflection said, voice softer now. "You're the key. You always have been. You're the one who will decide whether the future can save itself or whether it will unravel the past beyond repair." Zane felt a lump rise in his throat. There it was again, the future, like it was already a done deal, like whatever path he chose, the end was inevitable. He didn't want to believe it. He didn't want to believe that the weight of all existence rested on him. But the older version of himself was right. The virus was already changing things. The future was slipping into the present in ways that were impossible to stop. The very concept of time was breaking down, as though reality itself had been set adrift, like a ship with no anchor. "I don't know how to stop it," Zane whispered, his voice hoarse, almost pleading. He felt small, alone, with nothing but the fragments of equations and the broken timeline surrounding him. "I don't know what to do." "You already do," his reflection replied, a flicker of empathy in the older version's eyes. "You've known all along. The solution isn't in the equations. It's in you. You have to sever the link. You have to break the cycle." Zane's breath caught in his throat. Sever the link? Break the cycle? What did that even mean? It sounded so simple, yet it felt like a choice that could unravel everything. Could he really destroy the virus? Could he really make the decision to tear apart the very thing that held the future and the present together? He thought about Sophie, about the people he'd met, people caught in the virus's grip, flickering between timelines, seeing their own futures unfold before their eyes, unable to control it. He thought about the man in the coffee shop, the strange visitor who had first hinted at this truth. Had he been a reflection too? Or had he been a version of himself from a future that hadn't quite happened yet? Zane had so many questions, but none of them mattered now. The only question that remained was what he was going to do about it. The older Zane stepped forward, his movements slow but deliberate, as though he were guiding Zane toward something. The reflection's gaze never wavered, never faltered. Zane felt a knot in his stomach, the weight of the decision pulling him deeper into the abyss. He couldn't ignore the urgency, couldn't ignore the terror creeping up his spine. "It's already happening," his reflection said, voice firm, commanding. "Every moment you waste brings the world closer to destruction. You think you can solve this with calculations, with logic. But the only solution lies in choice. A choice to sever the timeline, to stop the virus from spreading further. You have to make the decision, Zane. Now. Before it's too late." Zane stepped back, shaking his head, as if physically moving away from the impossible weight of what he was being asked to do. "I don't know if I can," he muttered. What if I make the wrong choice?" The reflection smiled, but there was no comfort in it. It was a smile that carried the burden of years, of futures lived and lost. "There is no right or wrong choice. There is only the choice. Once you make it, there will be no going back. But you already know that, don't you?" Zane closed his eyes, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He could feel the weight of time shifting around him, the tension building to an unbearable pitch. He could almost hear the universe groaning, as if it were on the edge of collapsing, of breaking apart at the seams. Could he do it? Could he really sever the connection between the past, present, and future? Zane opened his eyes again, and his reflection was still standing there, unwavering, waiting. And in that moment, Zane understood that the virus wasn't just an infection. It wasn't just something that needed to be stopped. The virus was the collapse. It was a manifestation of everything breaking, everything overlapping, everything that should never have been allowed to coexist, and he was the one who had to decide how it would end. He turned toward the console, his fingers trembling as they hovered over the keys. The calculations were right there in front of him. He had spent months obsessing over them, trying to understand the mechanics of the virus, tracing its mutations, its growth, its effects on the flow of time. And now he saw it all with crystal clarity. The solution was simple. The solution was destruction. He had to erase the timeline. He had to sever the connection between the present and the future before it could collapse entirely. Zane's fingers moved without hesitation, typing in the final commands that would initiate the collapse. The virus would have no place to anchor itself. The reflections would cease. The fractures in time would close. Everything would reset, even if it meant losing everything they had built. Even if it meant sacrificing the future for the present. He hit enter, the machine hummed to life, the lights flickering. Zane felt a cold rush of air sweep through the room, a wave of energy that felt like the world itself was being rewritten, recalibrated. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, everything around him seemed to disappear, like the universe was holding its breath, waiting for the final moment. Then, the sound of the machine faded, leaving only silence. Zane opened his eyes. The lab was still. The reflection of himself was gone. The hum of the machine had stopped. But something was different. The weight that had been crushing his chest, the constant pressure of knowing that time itself was unraveling, had lifted. It was over. He had done it. He turned toward the window, staring out at the quiet city below. It was still there. It was still real. And for the first time in months, Zane felt a fragile kind of peace. He had severed the link. The timelines had been rewritten. The future and the past could no longer intersect, but the world, it was still here. And it was still his end of story.